In this video about critical approaches to literature, we'll look at applying a feminist lens. But first, what is literary criticism and why do we do it? Well, literary criticism is the study and interpretation of works of literature. Studying literature informs us of the self as well as others around us, culture, history, psychology, philosophy, economics, and so much more. Now, one way to study literature is to apply specific lenses and look for certain concepts or structures. And to help us do this, we use established ideas and theories within the human sciences, such as Marxism, psychoanalysis, feminism, and post-colonialism. Now, the first question to explore is, what exactly do feminist critics do? Well, for anyone who already has some experience with critical theory, such as Marxism or post-colonialism, you might be aware of the kind of binary thinking one applies. In some, you can view the binaries, or two ends of a spectrum, of a particular element in society. In Marxist theory, this would be the bourgeoisie or the ruling class, or the proletariat or lower classes. In post-colonialism, it's the colonizer versus colonized. We look at these binaries and then question, does the text give more value to one than the other? Does the text reproduce stereotypes or challenge them? And does the text highlight the ways one group is oppressed and how? Now, the same is true for feminist theory. Here the binary becomes masculine or feminism, and the questions still apply. But why is it important to be a feminist critic? Well, literature and cultural texts are not created in a vacuum. They emerge from societies and cultures and reflect the beliefs, values, practices, and ideologies of a particular culture. As we consume text, we reinforce or we question the values and we change accordingly. So this is a symbiotic relationship where a change in one is likely to yield a change in another. So Victorian literature, for example, the ways in which men and women behave is very different to the literature of today. As one changes, the other might change. Now, a feminist critic seeks to question the presentation of women and men and femininity and masculinity in society through the medium of literature. Through applying a feminist lens to a text, we can understand more about the social treatment of women and gender more generally. Now, the first part of feminist theory is to consider traditional stereotypes. Take the traditional and nuclear family. The husband goes to work and provides, whereas the wife stays at home looking after children, performing homely duties. Today, this stereotype still exists, but it's no longer the norm for many women. Alternatively, if you look at older Disney movies, you find that women are often pretty princesses, damsels in distress, they need saving from a Prince Charming. They're kind, they sing, they clean with the help of little woodland creatures. On the contrary, female villains might be ugly or use evil magic. These stereotypes do become harmful because they subtly suggest that to be feminine is to be beautiful, subservient, and passive. To act outside of these norms makes one a villain. There's also the very traditional stereotype of the traditional matriarch or the mother, a significant figure in the household who is maternal and caring. Their job is to take care of children and the home. Again, this is very limiting for women. If women do own their sexuality in the media, they might be a kind of temptress who lead men astray, or worse, a kind of femme fatale or sexualized female killer. Of course, there is the blonde bimbo as well. You can see that all of these feminine stereotypes can be quite harmful to the roles of women that they're expected to often perform, and they're limited to these. Alternatively, men are intelligent, logical, and analytical in the media. They're stoic and hard. They're suave and sophisticated, or they're strong. They might be troubled, but this is with an element of charm. Even if men might still be limited to certain roles, these roles are often a lot more free and a lot more positive than their female counterpart. Now, if you were to Google traditional gender stereotypes, you'll get a dozen images similar to this. And when you start looking at the adjectives, you find that for women, they are limited often to subservient or passive stereotypes, whereas men are taught to be tough, logical, active, dominant, independent. The true is the same for women within these very rigid, outdated stereotypes. Now, this brings me to part 2, gender performance. So this is Judith Butler, a feminist thinker and activist. They argue that biological sex, or the chromosomes which determine our biological male or female sex, is not equal to gender, which is performative. This is because, as Butler argues, gender is a social construct or an agreement among members of a group. In other words, society has decided what it means to be masculine or feminine, but this has nothing to do with biology. This becomes evident when one looks through space and time. In ancient Egypt, for example, men wore makeup. By today's standards, that'd be seen as pretty feminine. You can see how gender is not a natural phenomenon, but a social one. In addition, Victorian aristocrats dressed children in dresses. Again, not very masculine today. In ancient Mongolia, women were warriors, not just caretakers of the home. Butler claims that it is society which says something is for boys or for girls, not biology. Now, this becomes problematic because if society says one behaviour is for boys and another is for girls, then we as people tend to repeat and recreate that. We might see boys as fighting and say, well, boys will be boys, but this can be harmful as it suggests that men should be aggressive. And when thinking about the binary opposite, women should be passive. Society might say it is feminine for biological girls to play with dolls, but this can also be harmful as we recreate this performance and expect little girls to perform miniature versions of a housewife role. On the inverse, what about girls who wish to perform a more masculine role, whether this be like rugby or boxing, or boys who wish to bake or play with dolls? This can lead to internalized problems. And you can see how gender expectations can be very limiting, particularly when gender is not linked to biological sex, according to Butler. Instead, Butler suggests that we subvert or challenge traditional gender performances linked to our biological sex. Examples might be girls playing more traditionally on masculine sports or boys playing with dolls. Other examples, like the two you see now, Harry Styles or Zendaya, subvert traditional performance in the way that they dress. So, next, part 3, we have skyscrapers, rockets, missiles, police batons, bats, cigars, memorials, and other architecture. All examples of the celebration of male achievement, and all seem to celebrate the male in another way. Their shape is undeniably male. In a society where the man is often prioritised, values, and, to be honest, put at the centre of everything, the world has historically been constructed from the male perspective. Phallocentricism is the idea that the phallus, or penis, is central to the human experience. Not just the phallus on its own, of course, but the owner of the phallus, a man, a proper person. When we read literature, or look at any cultural text, or even navigate our own worlds, think about ways in which male dominance seem to be implicitly celebrated. For example, urban cities might be phallocentric, given that there are lots of tall buildings. The opposite might be rural areas, the natural world, Mother Nature, which is often given more value in society. If you said the urban cities, you can see how masculinity has become the dominant force. After all, it is Mother Nature, not Father Nature. A feminist thinker would question what symbols or settings are phallocentric. Why, after all, is a banana more valuable than a fig? What does it mean when phallic symbols or settings are valued over their opposite, gynocentric settings or symbols? In a world which does favour men or give them more power, we can see the patriarchy at play. So structures which favour one group over another and give more power to one are everywhere. One example is obviously class structures which favour the ruling class or bourgeoisie over the lower classes. The ruling classes benefit from the lower classes. In feminist theory, the patriarchy is a structural hierarchy which puts men above women. This structure can be seen socially, economically, and politically. In the household, the husband or father are often at the top with more power. In fact, the word patriarchy borrows its roots from the Latin pater, meaning father. In a family, when the man has more power, with the woman second or even below second, this is an example of the patriarchy as it favours men. Seeing this in the family then normalises such structures outside. For instance, politically, men still often have more power in most countries, as most countries are still ruled by men. In America, the patriarchal structures were evident as it was the founding fathers, not the founding mothers, which had power in a time when women couldn't even vote. In business, boardrooms might be male dominated. If CEOs or those in power are men, it is an example of the patriarchy. In subtler ways, the patriarchy normalizes masculine behaviors as being valued more. In an office, aggression and being assertive are often favored over more feminine traits like empathy and kindness. Misogyny is a result of the patriarchy. It is the physical form of hatred, fear, and violence, or a dislike towards women and femininity. In her book Down Girl by Kate Mann, she argues that if the patriarchy is the ideological structure, the belief that men should have more power, then misogyny is the enforcement to those who go against the status quo. In other words, the patriarchy is the ideology that men are more important, and misogyny is the repressive behaviours which enforce such a belief. Finally, we have the male gaze. In a cultural text, particularly when created by a man within the patriarchal structure, women are often depicted and objectified through the eyes of heterosexual men. Their value is often reduced to the fetishization and exploitative sexual gaze through which men see women. Now take these two movies featuring Margot Robbie's Harley Quinn, Suicide Squad and Birds of Prey. Can you guess which one was made by a man? If you guess the one on the left, her presentation in the Suicide Squad, then you're right. This portrayal reduces her role to the eye candy for men, particularly heteronormative men, giving masculinity more power and diminishing feminine value. Check the ways a text reinforces or challenges its portrayal of women in relation to sexualization and objectification. So, how can you use feminist theory in literature? Well, there are some important guiding questions to ask yourself. The first, does the text challenge or reinforce traditional gender performances? And if so, how? In what ways is the text setting depicted as being patriarchal? How is masculinity depicted in the text versus the depiction of femininity? Which has more value? Are symbols, settings, or items of value phallocentric or gynocentric? What does this suggest about the value of men versus women? And in what ways do structures oppress women in the text? Now, let's see an example from our anchor text, John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. But first, a little bit of context if you need it. So, the novel was written in the 1930s, an important time in America. We have the Wall Street crash, the subsequent economic depression, there's high unemployment, there's also an environmental disaster known as the Dust Bowl, which destroyed farms, and workers had to migrate across the country. Now, during this time, inequality is rife. We have Jim Crow laws, which treated African Americans unfairly, but women also lacked power. Now, there's one female character who lives on the ranch, and that's Curly's wife. Of Mice and Men is the story about George and Lenny, two men, but it's important to still pay attention to the roles of masculinity and femininity within the text. Now, the first question we can ask is, does the text challenge or reinforce traditional gender performance, and how? Well, there are not a lot of female characters in the novella, but one of the only female characters, the only one to live on the ranch, is Curly's wife. She is depicted as being purty or pretty, dressed in traditionally feminine clothes, the red dress, the red shoes. She's somewhat naive. In one chapter, it's revealed that she believed a stranger would make her a movie star, although he never wrote to her after that night. And she's flirtatious, somewhat of a temptress, described as jailbait and a rat trap by other men. However, it is really important to note that readers, for the most part in the novella, only get this view from the eyes of men, establishing the ways in which men often limit women to certain roles. Now, another female character is Lenny's Aunt Clara. While she does not have a physical role, we see her in Lenny's imagination or in George's memory of her. She is the traditional matriarch. She wears a housewife's clothing. She's kind and empathetic, giving mice to Lenny when he was young. Again, she is reduced to a very traditional stereotype, reinforcing traditional gender performances or assigning roles to women. Finally, when considering the men on the ranch, they often embody traditional masculine performance. They fight and are aggressive. They drink, they gamble, they love guns and violence. Lenny, although physically the strongest, however, is somewhat empathetic and soft-natured. He, to an extent, challenges traditional masculine performance, but he is also portrayed as childlike and slow. Now, this can be problematic as it might suggest that femininity is also childlike and naive. The second question is, in what ways is the text setting depicted as being patriarchal? Well, I have the hierarchy of the ranch from the video on Marxism. As you can see, Curly's wife is at the bottom of the hierarchy, whilst men take stronger social roles. This is an example of the patriarchy, and it is enforced and women are oppressed through limiting roles. For example, Curly's wife is the possession of Curly, indicated by the possessive, whilst audiences never know her real name. In addition, she is excluded and left behind on the ranch when the other men leave, and she's not allowed to enter certain areas. She's restricted to her own physical space as well as her own social space. Finally, she is silenced. We only see her through the eyes of men until later chapters, signifying a lack of feminine voice. The next question is, how is masculinity depicted in the text versus the depiction of femininity, and which has more value? Now, George is the protagonist. He's strong, logical, hardworking, and stoic, all masculine traits. Without him, Lenny wouldn't have survived. Thus, masculinity is depicted as something weaker people are dependent of. Slim is the prince of the ranch. That's what he's called by the men. Again, he's a man's man who does not let emotions get the best of him, and he's respected by all others. By calling him a prince and having all the other men look up to him, it signifies how masculinity is valued. Curly is aggressive and violent, although he is insecure. He embodies a different kind of masculinity, a more toxic version, in which he tries to perform a very masculine role with no room for any feminine emotions, and thus it results in his violent behaviour often. On the other side, we have Curly's wife. She is seen as a temptress, but she's also naive and weak. There are soft animals, which can be seen as feminine due to them being soft, but they're also weak and killed. The rabbits, the mice, the puppies. And then we have Lenny, who does not perform a fully masculine role, but he desires safety and softness, definitely more feminine than other men on the ranch. However, all of these more feminine characters die off, suggesting that femininity might be weaker than masculinity. Conversely, the masculine men do seem to be sad and they're missing something. Masculinity is certainly critiqued as being lonesome as well as brutal. Finally, I might ask, are settings or symbols phallocentric or gynocentric? What does this suggest about the value of men versus women? Well, as mentioned, the more feminine symbols or gynocentric symbols like soft animals die. However, more masculine or phallocentric symbols like Carlson's gun are fetishized and worshipped. They also have power, they take lives. Now, the setting is rural, it's natural, Mother Nature. In some contexts, this is definitely more feminine, unlike urban settings. Steinbeck also uses a lot of beautiful imagery to give value to such a setting, like at the beginning of chapter 1. It's described as such a beautiful, calming place. However, he seems to also critique masculinity to an extent by having boys and men beat this natural place, wear things down, make fires there. To that extent, how do you read of Mice and Men with all of this in mind? Do you see it as a novella which is problematic in its depiction of women, or do you read it as a critique of masculinity and the patriarchy? Is it a feminist text or a patriarchal text? Both have arguments and ample evidence to support each idea. Now, before you go, remember, literary criticism is looking at literature using the human sciences to understand more about the world around us. When doing a feminist analysis, we can look at the ways a text challenges or reinforces traditional gender performance, the way a text might be seen as patriarchal, how masculinity or femininity are depicted and which has more value. We can look at symbols and settings as being phallocentric or gynocentric, again signifying which has more value. And we can look at the ways in which women are oppressed within a text. Good luck with your feminist criticisms.